Hey, so welcome back to another Bio 100. And I don't remember if we did this a few weeks ago or not. I'm pretty sure we did. Where we put up this picture and I asked you to just go ahead and outline all the possible biology that you can see in this picture. Well, what I'd like to ask you to do again is to hit the pause button and to take out a piece of paper or pencil or something electronic where you can take notes. And I want you to write down all the biology that you could possibly see in this picture again. Okay, hopefully you actually did that. And ask yourselves, did you put down more now than you did before? You feel like you're actually learning something, things coming across, you've seen more deeply into this image than you did before? I sure hope so. So here's some questions that we're going to address today. And before we get into the major lecture, and what I'd like to actually ask is, do you have any questions about evolution in general and or human evolution from the things that we covered? And if you do, what I'd love for you to do is to go ahead and write me an email on Learning Suite or to me directly. Even if you don't feel comfortable coming to me, you can come to your TAs, whatever you need, but just any questions that you might have about evolution in general or human evolution from our last couple of lectures. So please take the time to do that. I'm going to go ahead and move forward into the lecture, and hopefully we can understand a little bit more. So today we're going to talk about natural selection, which is kind of this driving force behind evolution. Now normally we're together in a course and I pass out felt fabric that represents an environment, and then I give you an envelope that are full of quote-unquote mice, which are really just small pieces of felt. And there are two different colors of felt mice. One that matches the fabric background and one that doesn't. And so I ask you to put 5 of each color in the environment. And then some of you, then I'll break people up into groups, right? So some groups will be a fox, some groups will be hawks. And then we play a game. And basically what you do is you cover your eyes for 20 seconds. And then for only 3 seconds, we uncover your eyes and you're allowed to attack any of the mice or pick up any of the mice that you see in the environment. Then you can only use your index finger and your thumb, which we call the pincer grasp, which is like one of my most favorite things in the world when a baby first does the pincer grasp. I think it's adorable. But you can use that pincer grasp however you want. You can modify it a little bit in angle and whatever, but that's all you can do. And then after each round, each color mouse or felt patch is going to be left in the environment, and you're actually going to add the same number to the color environment of what's left. So you repeat this with each member of the group, and the groups are generally 4 to 5 students. You're going to keep track of how many mice, their color, and how each person used their grasp while predating on the mice. And essentially what students find is after several rounds, what's left predominantly are the mice that match the background. And this makes sense, right? Because our visual systems are tuned to find contrast. And it turns out that the fox and the hawk, although their visual systems are not exactly like humans, they're similar in that way of what they're able to see, and that they're best at distinguishing prey that do not match the background. And that's why you have a lot of animals in the animal kingdom that have evolved to match the background. And so the question then becomes, well, is this a real example? Can we find examples like this in biology? And indeed we can. There's a group of mice that live in the western United States, particularly in Arizona, where this group is, and they live out on these lava flows. And these are ancient lava flows that bubbled up in the deserts. You find these in Utah as well. As a matter of fact, on the way to St. George, between Cedar City and St. George, if you look up on the hillside, you'll see some lava flows up there. And they are just remnants of ancient lava that bubbled up. They look like this when you're close up on them. And what's really cool is you have these mice that live in these environments. Now, this is the exact same species of mouse. Okay, there's no these are just individuals in the same population, same species, very little genetic differentiation. However, what you find is that mice in these environments with dark coats live on the lava flows, and mice in these environments with light tan coats live off the lava flows. And you can see why from this image, right? That these two right here are in stark contrast, and just from the game that we played, you would predict that these two would be predated on more than these two. And that's exactly what we see in nature. And there's a whole bunch of cool science here where they've gone in and they've figured out the gene that it can actually switch the coat color and how it's being selected for. And at the moment they're able to go in and start to look and see genetic differences that are arising between the dark coated individuals and the light coated individuals just by their environment. Pretty fascinating. Okay, so Darwin discussed two ideas of how natural selection can cause evolution. And one of them is common descent, which we've talked about a little bit, where you essentially have life that arose and then it descends, right, through time. The other is natural selection. And natural selection is really the primary force. Currently, it's considered to be the primary force of evolution. And there are other factors too, and we'll talk about those in the next chapter, such as genetic drift and sexual selection, but natural selection appears to be the primary force. So here are 4 observations for natural selection. Number 1, individuals within populations vary. We know this. We can look across BYU campus, you can look across anywhere in the world where you go, where you look at the populations, there is a lot of variation. Even within highly homogeneous populations, you're still going to see variation in terms of eye color, hair color, whatever it may be. Okay, number 2, individual variation can be passed on. We know this as well, right? That individuals that look very similar, that have children generally, or have children look very similar to themselves. And vice versa. Individuals look very different when they have children. You can see the genetics that have been passed on from 2 individuals that look very different to their offspring. Populations produce more offspring than will survive. This is absolutely true. We know that even for human populations. And then survival and reproduction are not random, meaning that both survival and reproduction are something that isn't just absolutely, positively, there is choice involved at some level here. Okay? Alright, so let's hit each one of these. Individuals within populations vary. So true for all living organisms. Even asexual organisms that don't breed are going to have variation due to mutation. It's more than just color, etc. There are things like blooming time in flowers, right? So these flowers are blooming earlier than the rest of the flowers around them, which would give them potentially an advantage with natural selection. If you can bloom earlier than other flowers and bees are out, you're going to get more attention from bees. It's also a disadvantage. If you bloom early and there's a frost, then all of your reproductive parts will be frozen and there won't be any ability to produce seed. There's also resistance to drugs. We've heard about this quite a bit, that some bacteria currently are resistant to drugs. Okay, some variation is inherited by the offspring. So Darwin noticed that animal breeders could get exaggerated traits through selective breeding, right? And this is kind of what we see here. So if you look at this, you've got these pigeons. Now these pigeons are all the same species, but there have been traits within those species that breeders have brought out. So you have the fantail, you have the hood, the feathered feet, and even something crazy going on here that I don't know what to call it, some sort of curled feather frizz type thing. All of these were brought about by the fact that the variation is very often inheritable by the offspring. The other one is that populations can produce more than will ever survive. Even really slow breeding animals like elephants can produce large populations in a relatively quick amount of time. So here's the first, second, third, and fourth generations that are possible to come from elephants during their lifetime. over several generations, I should say. So survival and reproduction are not random, remember? So fitness is the relative survival and reproduction of one variant. Adaptation is the fitness that increase individuals' fitness. Sorry, these are traits that increase individual fitness in an environment. And then individuals with adaptations for a particular environment are more likely to survive and thus reproduce over time. So it's not random. That individuals that are more adapted generally will survive longer and reproduce more over time. Now, this is interesting to think about this, right? When we're talking about fitness, we're not talking about physical fitness per se, although that can certainly play into it. But we can just talk about the ability to survive and reproduce. So, if we had all 60 of us in our class together, we would be able to very easily say that I am almost certainly the fittest person in the room. Now, it's really funny when I say that because almost always there's some musclehead in the class who isn't listening very carefully, and then all of a sudden will look up and be like, hey, wait, what? You can't be fitter than me. Well, the fact of the matter that I have 7 children means that I am the most biologically fit person in the class. Now, will some of you pass me up in my lifetime? Unlikely, but it's possible. Some of you could have 7 or more children and be as fit or more fit than me. And there could be some sort of adaptation that can drive this fitness, and I won't get into that any further in terms of metaphors, but you can kind of understand where we're headed. So there's something called artificial selection, and artificial selection is really just selection that's been imposed by humans. So we're using the principles of natural selection to artificially select for things that humans desire. So there's lots of examples of this. Dogs are all one species, but what's happened is the variation within that species has been selected for to create things like French Bulldogs and Great Danes and Chihuahuas and just everything you can imagine, right? I actually own a French Bulldog, and it's just a tribute to artificial selection. Super cool dogs that have been bred to maximize human comfort, basically. We've also had dogs like Blue Heelers that are just fantastically athletic, wonderfully work-driven dogs, and these are all things that have been selected for, both behaviors, physical appearance, and the ability to work. And there's also things that humans do in terms of crops, and you got to check this out, okay? So this is the common wild mustard, okay? And it has been, through artificial selection, it has been turned into no less than 6 other crops, the vast majority of which you probably don't like, but you got to still appreciate how awesome this is. So from this one common wild mustard, things like kohlrabi, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, and kale have all been derived. And even things like broccolini and all the different types of kale that there are. There's different types of cauliflower, cabbage, all these different types have all been brought back and derived from this one species. Now that is fantastic amount of artificial selection that we probably eat fairly regularly, or should. Okay, so here's some natural selection in wild populations. So there are a lot of examples. So the evolution of tuberculosis to antibiotics is actually tuberculosis, kind of this wild population of disease that affects humans. There's also ones in Galapagos finches. I'm going to provide an example in just a second, and things like butterflies, that we can actually look how natural selection has worked there. But why? Why does it work? Well, hopefully this gives some insight. So if we're in the field, natural populations, here is a figure of some finches from the Galapagos Islands. And we're talking about bill depth here. This is the number of individuals on the y-axis, bill depth on the x-axis, and then these are the years. I want you to just look at this for a second and see if you can figure out what's going on in this graph. It's going to be really important for you to understand this eventually, right? So take a look at this, hit the pause button, see if you can decipher what's going on in this graph. Okay, let's come back together. So by looking at this, one of the things that you'll probably notice is that in the year 1976, you had tons of individuals, right? Number of individuals, lots of individuals, and a wide range of bill depth going on. And then you'll notice in 1978, there's this crash in the population. They're down to very few individuals, and the bill depth has shifted. It's shifted to be larger. Now, why? Why would this happen? Why has the bill depth shifted to the left? To the right. Have you read the book? Do you know what are the reasons for it? Because I can promise you, you're going to want to know. Okay? So it actually had to do with the size of seeds. So there was a severe drought that hit the island in just after 1976. It caused the population to crash, and those individuals that were left on the island were those with larger beaks and had the ability to break open seeds that were scarce, larger, and harder. So they had to have a bill to be able to do that, to break those seeds open to get the nutrients. And so those individuals with smaller bill depths that didn't have the ability to break those seeds open died. All right, so let's talk about the modern synthesis. So the modern synthesis is really this idea of the union of genetics with evolution and natural selection. So we had this knowledge of genetics that it really facilitates evolutionary mechanisms, and it does this by alleles. They are the basis of trait variation, right? So remember what an allele is, right? You can have the gene for eye color, but there'll be an allele for blue, an allele for brown, sometimes allele for green, right? That these are the alleles that determine eye coloration. So mutations they don't have to, but they can create new alleles, and these new alleles can lead to new traits. Not always, but they can. And natural selection is what determines whether they can or can't, because it really provides the filter for these new traits and mutations to pass through. So if you think of natural selection as kind of a filter, and mutations have to go through that filter to survive into the next generation, that's probably a very appropriate way to think about natural selection. Okay, so you can test for natural selection in the laboratory. So we can manipulate environmental conditions, we can look at the effects on the population over time, and one of the cool ways we can do this is things like alcohol metabolism in fruit flies. Now this is generally much more interesting in other universities where alcohol among students is a much higher presence, not so much here at BYU, but just the same, you have, we'll look at alcohol metabolism in fruit flies. So animals have alcohol metabolizing enzymes. All humans have it, all animals have it. But there's a variation in the metabolism of alcohol within populations of animals. So here's an example in fruit flies. So if you're looking here, this is the percent of the population that metabolizes alcohol rapidly. Okay, so this is your normal fruit fly laboratory experiment where you're feeding them on food that does not have a high alcohol content. And what you'll see is that there's no change in alcohol metabolizing rate. It's still present at a very low level. But then if you go over here, if you take this same generation, okay, if you take this same population here, but you feed them on a high alcohol environment, you'll find that after 57 generations, which is really not that long, this can be done in a matter of months, find that after 50 generations, these fruit flies actually have a much higher ability to metabolize alcohol than the original population. Okay, so let's take this a step further. So mutation, natural selection, how does it work? So here's the regular environment. Okay, you have these individuals that do not metabolize alcohol very well, and then you have this mutant. Okay, this mutant has the ability to metabolize alcohol at a really high level. So then if you move into an alcohol-rich environment, the mutant genetics are going to come to the forefront, and they're going to be selected for, because these flies can get more nutrients out of the environment, they're stronger, more fit, and they're more physically fit and essentially more able to breed and mate and pass their genetics on. So that makes sense, right? Well, what if the environment never changes? What if you get this mutation here? Can it really spread out in a regular environment? Well, it's almost certainly not going to happen that way. And that this mutation, because there's no advantage to be able to metabolize alcohol at a high level, these flies will outcompete the fly that has the ability to metabolize alcohol at a high level, and that fly will almost certainly that fly and those genetics will almost certainly be pushed out of the population. Okay, so there are a lot of misconceptions about natural selection, and I'm actually not going to go over these in detail, but what I would like you to do is to hit the pause button and read through these, because I think they're really insightful, and you may even have found yourself speaking in these same ways, kind of this misunderstanding of evolution and natural selection. Okay, calling dodos stupid because they weren't adapted to avoid hunters. Well, there's reasons for that. Okay, and I think this one down here in particular is one you should read, this bottom one. A lot of times students are like, well, why haven't chimps, why aren't they becoming human? Well, there's reasons for that. Okay, so some other things I want to outline here. Natural selection cannot cause new traits to arise or new traits to evolve. It's not an issue of choice or will, right? Like that fruit fly that gets thrown into an environment of alcohol, of a high alcohol content, can't just look to the heavens and say, I've got to be able to have the gene to metabolize alcohol. That gene was either there or not there. And so selection can only act on already existing variation at the time of selective forces arrives, right? So just like our previous example with the fly, that mutation to metabolize alcohol at a high level already had to be present when the environment with a high alcohol content was brought forward, okay? So we talked about the fly example. So we talked about this, right? That the alcohol-rich environment did not cause a mutated gene to happen. It was differential survival that caused the gene or the allele to become more common. So natural selection does not make perfection. Now this is a really hard one for a lot of students to wrap their heads around for whatever reason. And I think it has to do with like our human ideals of becoming perfect or perfected. But organisms are not necessarily better than one another. They're just better fit to a particular situation, right? And adaptation that is beneficial in one situation might actually be a liability in another. So think about the flies again with the alcohol gene. Also think about the flower example that we had, right? That those flowers were, those early bloomers were going to get a lot of attention from bees and have a huge advantage, but they're also going to be in a disadvantage if there's a late frost or whatever it might be that would frost those flowers, and then they wouldn't be able to reproduce. So there are always trade-offs between a better fit in one situation versus another, and that's what we want to talk about here. There's no perfection, there are just trade-offs. Adaptation is going to be constrained to the underlying biology as well. And it's really just this idea of what is even available to selection. So, for example, pandas, whether you knew it or not, actually have a thumb, and the thumb bone comes off of these sigmoid bones here at the base of the quote unquote, or the hand of the panda paw. Now, we mentioned the bone comes from the wrist. The human thumb is opposable and it's very efficient, and so our thumbs actually come from different bones. They are different. They have different usages, but nonetheless, pandas have a thumb and we have a thumb, and we've gotten it through convergent evolution, and it's really cool. So pandas are just using their thumb to essentially manipulate bamboo here, right? Whereas our thumb is used for a lot of other things on top of it. So both have thumbs from two different bones, but somewhat similar function. Okay, so there are different environmental conditions that can lead to selective changes in populations, and so we are able to classify different types of selection. Okay, so this one is called diversifying or disruptive selection, and that is a selection for the extreme. So the red represents the original population, so original population here, and then for whatever reason, those individuals in the middle are selected against. So there will be selective pressure that will push down here, and it will cause disruptive selection, so you're getting different forms out on this side. Okay, and that could be something like if you think about the mouse example, right? Perhaps the major individuals in the middle were some sort of color between tan and gray to black, and then because of the environment they live on, it pushes in here and it pushes some mice to be tan and some mice to be black. There are other examples too, where you might have birds, for example, that live in an area where there are two different lifestyles, where birds that are able to fly short distances and have really good wing control can maximize some sort of resource, and those birds that have larger wings and are able to fly longer distances are able to maximize another resource. So those birds in the middle that are kind of just in between can't really maximize either resource as well, so they're selected against. There's something called stabilizing selection as well, and this is kind of the averaging of traits. So here's your original population here, and then because of selective forces, it's actually pushing the population more towards the center, and this is what we call stabilizing selection. So drawing on birds again, this could be an example where birds with really short wings don't do so well, and birds with really long wings don't do so well. So the population through natural selection is pushed towards having kind of these medium-sized wings that allow them to maximize whatever resource is available. There's also directional selection here. This is going to be change in population traits over time, and so this might be the original population distribution, but after natural selection starts to work, it can be pushed this way. Now, if you think about the Darwin-Finch's example that we just showed, two of these types of selection are shown in that example. You should go back and figure out which two those are. Okay, so we've talked about these, we've talked about the mouse colors, we've given a lot of examples. What about bird populations in a storm, right? Darwin's finches and the drought. So this can only happen at a time, right? So the question is, right, the question here is like, can multiples happen at a time? And I already told you in the previous slide to go back to Darwin's finch example, and you should be able to identify two of these examples happening at the same time. So it's not just about, so at this point, I like to take a step back, because students have started to get this idea that evolution and natural selection, that it's always about getting more food, being the biggest, being well camouflaged, flower, just like all these crazy things, right? That it's about being the biggest and the best all the time. But selection is really complex. There are a lot of other strategies that can keep diversity in a population. And then the example that I love to bring up that I think resonates well with students is this idea of, have you ever heard of sneaker males? And just to give you, just hit the pause button. What do you think a sneaker male is if you've never heard of them before? Okay, hopefully you took a second to think about that. Well, let's talk about what sneaker males are. So sneaker males are those that don't have the biggest, strongest genetics, but they're still well adapted to pass their genes on. So here's a cool example. So these are dung beetles, okay? So here's a pile of dung. This massive beetle will land on this dung, and it will dig these big burrows out, and it will sit at the top of its hole and wait for females to come. And when females come, it'll take the female and allow the female down into the galleries that it's dug, and it will push away any other males that want to come in and breed with those females. Well, what you have is what's called a sneaker male, who looks a lot like a female. And sneaker males are only really good at one thing, and that is digging. And they're not so great, they don't have big horns, they don't have a big body, they can't do combat directly with these guarding males, but what they can do is they can dig. So what these sneaker males do is they'll come to the edge of the dung pile, they'll dig down into these galleries, and while this male is guarding his hole, they'll come down, they'll burrow in, they'll mate with the female. The female will lay an egg in here, and this male will end up guarding that male's egg. It's called a sneaker male. So here's another example here in dragonflies, which is pretty fascinating. So you have the males here, sneaker male here, you have the dominant male and a dominant male,
and these two keep guard of a set of females. Okay, and they don't allow those females to move out. Well, what's really fascinating here is that while these two males are doing battle with each other over their females or over the territories or whatever it may be, I don't know if you caught that, but watch what the sneaker male does. The sneaker male sneaks out and he services all the females in this individual's territory. Thus passing on his genetics right under the nose of this individual. Okay, so this sneaker male genetics are sticking around. And I think that's pretty cool. Okay, so let's wrap this up with an activity. So, a natural selection activity. So those of you who've served missions in Central and South America, even parts of Florida, may have seen butterflies like this. They're called Heliconius butterflies. Okay, they're incredibly cool. So these are all Heliconius butterflies here. Okay, and these are what we call Heliconius mimics. So we're going to call them non-Heliconius or NH, and Heliconius as H. Now, Heliconius butterflies are highly toxic, and they're actually they show how toxic they are by the coloration that they show. And what's interesting is that you can have different species that look very much the same in terms of coloration and pattern. And sometimes this coloration and pattern can be mimicked pretty tightly by other butterflies and moths. And so the question really becomes, what adaptations would be selected for so that Heliconius can tell themselves apart from non-Heliconius? I want you to hit the pause button and think about that for a minute. Okay, hopefully you have an idea. Here's the next question. What adaptations would be selected for so that Heliconius can tell themselves apart from other Heliconius? Now remember, these Heliconius look extremely similar, right? And just like the exact same species. So you're trying to figure out, how would Heliconius even tell themselves apart? Hit the pause button, think about that for a minute. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about some adaptations, and you can adjust your hypotheses as needed. So here's one adaptation. So these are Heliconius. What we did, so this is some research I was part of, what we actually did is we took these yellow bands and we cut them out and we extracted the yellow coloration from them. And then we put them into a really fancy machine which will tell us the molecular weights of all the chemicals inside of these color bands. So here's the yellow from a non-Heliconius here, and the yellow from a Heliconius. We cut them out of the wings, we extracted them, and we put them on this fancy machine. And one of the things we noticed right away is that in the Heliconius, they have a yellow with a molecular weight of 224. Okay, and that same 224 should be right here, but it's not. You'll notice the major peaks in their yellow bands are around here at 337 and 365, among others. So we knew for sure that Heliconius they were using some sort of different coloration in their wing. So I want you to think about that for a minute in terms of your hypothesis. How do Heliconius tell themselves apart from non-Heliconius, and how do Heliconius tell themselves apart from other Heliconius? Readjust your hypothesis. Okay? All right. I'm going to show you another adaptation. So these are moths out here. Okay, and these are all true butterflies is what we call them. These are all different families of butterflies. One of the things we notice is that when you look at the visual system of butterflies, particularly what colors they're able to see, you can see that moths can see ultraviolet, blue, and long wavelength. Okay, anything with a color in here means that they have a protein in their eye that allows them to see those colors. But if you go to a group like this, the Papilionids, one of the things you notice is they can see ultraviolet, they can see blue, but they have multiple genes in the eye that are looking at long wavelength. And what this means is that they can see more deeply into long wavelength colors than moths can. Okay, and then you have this Pierid butterfly that can see more deeply into the blues, and so forth. Well, this is what's actually really interesting, is that if you look in Heliconius butterflies, they have a duplicated UV. No other butterfly group has a duplicate UV. So if you look over here, there's two groups with duplicated blues, there's groups with duplicated ultraviolet, but no group has a duplicated UV. So I want you to think about that in terms of your hypothesis. How do heliconias tell themselves apart from non-heliconias, and how do heliconias tell themselves apart from other heliconias? Well, here's the take home. So if you look on a phylogeny, this UV opsin duplicate, right, arose right here at this part, which is all of the heliconias. And if you look at that yellow color in the wing, which happens to be highly UV reflective, all of these individuals except two have that yellow coloration in the wing. And so what I'm showing you here at the time, and it still is, really high impact science, even though it looks so simple, but we were able to demonstrate for the first time that a visual system is highly attuned to coloration, and this is probably almost certainly how heliconias are telling themselves apart from non-heliconias that don't have the UV color, and also between other heliconias that have subtle variations in how the UV color is put on the wing. And that's where we're going to end today. I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope the class is going well and you're staying safe.